Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's just great to meet you and see you. I think we're going to be working together a little bit this year. You'll be seeing more training videos, and today was just sort of a launch to talk about the year ahead of you. And so I'm just excited to be here. The agenda for today, we're going to be talking about kind of behavior in schools and why do kids misbehave. And then I'm going to present a couple of the options that your leaders are interested in implementing this year with you. And that's PBIS and restorative practices. They're two different school climate initiatives, the two most popular and widely used in the world, probably. And I think we need both. And then we're going to get into the work of actually getting started with it today. So that's really exciting. So on a show of hands, how many people here have heard of restorative practices, restorative justice? Like like that's not new. What about PBIS? Positive behavior interventions and support. So a little of some fewer. Could you all turn to your partner and share with them kind of what you know? Maybe it was from a previous place you worked or you went to a training. So share kind of like how you know about those two things and what you think, okay? So just take 2 minutes. All right. So now that you've shared a little bit to your partner about kind of that schema or framework of where you heard about it, what do you know about it? We're going to just talk a little bit about what it means and what it could mean for your school. And then we're going to actually have some work time for you to do a little planning and talking about how do you want to make this happen. So just so you know, the ways you can find me, I'm on Facebook, so you can get on Facebook, Restorative PBIS. You can search my name and follow. We have people, about 1,200 people now in this group where people are talking about, posting questions and solutions and troubleshooting behavioral issues in their schools. So you're welcome to join there. You can also find me on my website. Today, I might be referring to some free downloads you can do, things for your classroom. You're welcome to go to lauramoyman.com. Go to the resources and there's a bunch of free things for you there. I think that the way that I found your school found me was finding me on YouTube, probably. I have a lot of really practical little videos that are free. Things about, having smooth transitions, how to correct behavior, how to call home when there's misbehavior in school, lots of tips and tricks. So you're welcome to find me there. And then Instagram. So you can follow me on my travels. I go to schools all over the world and talk to them and visit them and help improve school climate, culture, student behavior, things like that. So you're welcome to find me there. So where I came from was for several years, I was a school social worker, probably like 12 years. And then the last 10 years, of my school district career, I was a school district administrator in Napa, California, running all of their positive behavior support, restorative practices, all the mental health services, opening student wellness centers, things like that. So my mental health background and behavioral background, I kind of put all that together. And as a result, we had a lot of out of school suspensions and a lot of discipline that wasn't really working. And as you can see here, we had some amazing growth with reducing suspensions. Students we used to have over 5,000 days a year of kids missing school. We began implementing PBIS and restorative practices and saw huge declines in that. Kids, their behavior just got a lot better. Kids felt better at school. And as a result, we also had really positive school climate. So in a lot of states, you'll do school climate scores where kids can rate if they feel connected, safe, if they like school. And in California, our school district scored at the 99th percentile for having the best school climate scores. And we had 30 schools, so it wasn't just one, it would be all 30. And we did PBIS and restorative practices for about 10 years, but we got results, as you saw, after just right away. Within the first year, you'll see results doing the things that we're going to talk about doing. So that's kind of that solid implementation and sticking with it. So let's talk about what are we really talking about here? So if you think about your entire school population, what we know in the research is that about 10% of students they're going to have conduct problems, behavior issues. So in a class of 30, you'll have 3 kids that drive you crazy every year, right? So hold up on your hand, show your partner about how many kids were pretty challenging for you last year. So you had a class. So like how many kids? You're not going to say any names. You might know it, but just say 2, 3, 5, like how many like were come to mind right now? So statistically speaking, it would be about 10%. And then you have those years that you're like, it's a lucky year. And then you have years where it's more challenging, particularly after COVID, when kids came back, that number felt a lot higher, at least initially. And then for schools implementing the things I'm talking about, it kind of would shake out and go back to about the 10%. But, and you're not alone if when kids came back in session, it was crazy. We had kids rolling around on the ground, standing up and walking out of classrooms because they just didn't feel like doing school. All the things that they did. We had kids essentially with coping skills and behaviors that matched 2 years ago, right? So if you're a 3rd grade teacher, your kids came in acting like 1st graders at best, probably more like kinder. And that all the way through high school, you had freshmen coming in acting like 6th and 7th graders with bigger bodies, and we had big problems. And that was just an international kind of issue. And what I saw working with schools is the schools that were implementing PBIS restorative practices within just a few months, behaviors started to self-correct. Not self-correct. They were corrected by the school by setting up an environment, teaching expectations, and responding to it. Schools that didn't have that in place continued to have the behaviors occur until teachers were ready to quit, right? And so you have it, but you're not alone if that's what happened for you. The other statistic to know is that about 17% of our youth have mental health issues. So ADHD, bipolar, depression, all of it. And that's a pretty big number. So then if you think about your classroom like that, you would have nearly 20% of the kids that are significantly struggling. Anxiety is an epidemic in the US right now. And then we know that about 8% of your students account for most office discipline referrals, meaning kids that go to the office or need to be handled outside of the classroom. So we already know who these kids are. And I think the question that I would pose to you is, if we know, statistically speaking, this is the setup in your whole career, it's always been like this, why do we act surprised every year? We act like, what are we going to do with these kids? And why do they keep coming in like that? And rather than having a plan of what we're going to do. So what I would kind of suggest today is let's make the plan before they even come in so we know what we're going to do. And let's try to get these numbers to at least be this and not be way off the charts where half of the class is acting crazy and things like that. So we'll try to, like, on best case scenario, we only have 10% of the kids, and then we'll have a plan for what to do then. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So why do kids misbehave in the first place? Well, you know that just general limit setting, norms and procedures, having routines, right? Those of you that have taught any length of time, you know that the less clear you are with expectations and things like that, the more misbehavior occurs. And there's tips and tricks to getting better behavior by increasing structure, which I have a lot of that on my website, walking in line and different strategies in classrooms and things like that. But we also need to look a little deeper at misbehavior, not just testing like normal boundaries, but there might be other things going on. So you could have kids that have disabilities, that they have impulse control issues, things like that. And you can have kids with trauma and backgrounds that create some of this misbehavior. So we're going to kind of look at that. So let's talk about risk factors that could cause misbehavior. So we're going to look at it like this. So here's a kid on a bicycle. We'll call this student Carly. Is that okay, Carly? Call the student Carly. And Carly's going to have some risk factors in her life. And this basically what we look at is some sort of exposure to family, neighborhood, or societal risk factors. Now, this is based on research done by a doctor named Dr. Vince Felitti from Southern California. And he was responsible for what's now called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of ACEs trauma. Okay, so this work's been around probably since the 90s. And he was actually a physician, and he was working in the obesity clinic at the time. And as he was talking to his patients, he kept hearing like similar stories. If you go to AA and you hear people's life stories, the stories begin to sound similar. If you go to a prison and you hear childhood stories, the stories sound similar, right? Every movie you've ever seen, people have these certain hardships. And so he was wondering, what is it in kids? Is there anything predictive in a kid's life that would lead them to this clinic where they're having all these health problems? And what he found is that there were 10 things that could happen to a child that then would lead to these adverse kind of outcomes for kids. And the 10 things are physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parent criminality, drug and alcohol use by the caregiver, modeling of aggression. So that could be domestic violence primarily, but it also could be exposure to very violent media, horror movies, video games, which people argue that doesn't impact children, but research shows that it does. That's kind of where we are. Parent death or divorce, which we're also very uncomfortable with because the divorce rate's rather high, and we think, oh, we're not hurting our kids, but divorce is really, really, really damaging as well. And then you have a family member diagnosed with a mental illness. So those are the 10 things. And he would ask people these questions, and it's come to know, and there's an ACEs quiz you can take online, and it'll ask you these questions and you'll get a score from 0 to 10 on basically what are your risk factors? How many do you have? And what ends up happening in schools is, you're not seeing the end result that Dr. Felitti was seeing, or Felitti, that he was seeing in his clinic, but he was seeing all kinds of health issues, but we in schools see it a lot sooner. So what does it look like for us? These short-term kind of negative outcomes in schools looks like defiance, because all of the adults in my life have let me down, right? Lack of school readiness. A lot of these kids move a lot. So they come with different skills. They're not ready. Coercive interactive styles. So that feels like manipulative kind of problem solving, maybe kind of using like physical aggression to get what they want, because that's all they've ever learned. And then you have maladaptive behaviors then that you start to see in schools. So you start to see truancy, and that's often a kind of a flight response. So kind of, you don't like me, I don't like you, I don't want to be here. Parent teacher rejection, which I start to see by like second grade, that kids won't really want to hang out with the kid, causing a lot of problems. But then by middle school, they all find each other, and we call that a deviant peer group. Then you have low academic achievement, high number of school discipline referrals, so that's getting sent to the office, things like that. They move a lot, so they go to a lot of different schools. They get involved with drugs and alcohol, maybe teen pregnancy, and then an early age of first arrest. And then you have these long-term outcomes. That's where Dr. Felitti started. So more than just health problems, what he found is there was also school failure and dropout, delinquency, drug and alcohol use, gang membership, adult criminality, lifelong dependence on welfare system. And then this higher death and injury rate was disease, but also like really like risk-taking behaviors, like jumping off of a roof for fun, driving really fast. Definitely alcoholism is a big one. And what he found in the study is the tipping point is about 4. If you have 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, it can lead to these kind of outcomes. So you might be sitting here thinking, okay, but I would have 4 or more, but I'm here. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not in a gang. I'm physically healthy. What's that about? And what Dr. Felitti found was that, it wasn't necessarily predictive. So there was a higher risk of these outcomes. But what he didn't, go on to look at that other people have is really looking at resiliency research. So resiliency research really looks at, okay, so you have all these risk factors, but then you bounced back and you didn't succumb to these things. What is that about? And in there's like three main things that help us with that resiliency or bouncing back. And one is mindset. That's Carol Dweck's work with grit. Those of you raise your hand, you've heard of grit. Okay, some of you, I see that. So mindset is really believing that you can overcome something if you just work harder. That if something doesn't go your way, you're going to work harder next time. And not everyone actually has that. There are also people that like, hey, if it doesn't go my way, it's not meant to be. They did a study at a university, I think it was Harvard, where they had two groups of students and they took a very hard chemistry exam. I think it was pre-med. And some of the students, they got bad grades, and then they watched what happened. And the students that said, that's it, like, this isn't, I'm not cut out for this, they actually like changed their major. And then the other set said, if I work harder next time, I can do better. And then they ended up succeeding and staying. And so it can be inborn, but you can teach that too. So that's a proportion of people that are resilient, right? The other number two, I would say, is actually a conversion experience, which is finding faith. People, obviously, you hear stories a lot of, they maybe go to prison, but then they become a believer. They go to AA and they find a higher power. So that's absolutely legitimate in the research, is the conversion experience. But most of the time, the biggest percentage of people that kind of are resilient can point back. This is the number three. They point back to someone in their childhood, someone who was there for them, someone that supported them, someone that followed them and believed in them and helped them when they needed it. That was most of the time. So the three things: grit, mindset, conversion experience, or a positive adult in their life, 70% of the time, it was that positive adult in their life. And what's really interesting is about 75% of the time, that adult was at school. So there was some where it was like a neighbor, a pastor, something like that. But most of the time, that adult was at school. And so, what I want you thinking about is what we're discussing today is not just about giving out positive tickets and sitting in circles and talking about problems and things like that. It's actually about saving kids' lives and changing their trajectory in their future by being those people and creating a school environment where they feel supported and loved, so that they can bounce back, and it's good for all kids. So that's that kind of risk path idea. And here's the research on alcoholism for people with a score of 4 or more. About 16% of them go on to become alcoholics. Suicide attempts, almost 20% with 4 or more. And here's Nadine Burke-Harris, is actually a pediatrician, but she specializes in trauma. And she says it like this. She talks about, if you're in a forest and you see a bear, a very efficient fight or flight system instantly floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol and shuts off the thinking portion of your brain that would stop to consider other options. This is very helpful if you're in a forest and you need to run from a bear. The problem is when that bear comes home from the bar every night. So that's where that trauma occurs. It literally changes the child's brain in response to the trauma. And that's what we're feeling when we have those kids in our classes. That's kind of that idea of how that happens. And then you have Dr. Gabor Mate. Trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So these are all, the way we think, the way our brain develops as a response to that. And this is one of our lovely comics. Do I get partial credit for simply having the courage to get out of bed and face the world again today? And what we know about these kids that have experienced the hardest things is that they're most likely to come to school. Why do you think that is? So turn to your partner and say, why do you think it is that the kids that have the worst home lives are always at school? So many of you are saying probably that, school is the most consistent, caring place that they have, right? You're the best that they have. And as inadequate as we feel as educators, and we say we only have the 6 hours a day, your 6 hours is life-saving for these kids. So, you can also take comfort. Yes, it's a burden, but there's so much that we can do when they're with us. because just as there's a neurobiology of stress and trauma, there's a neurobiology of trust, relationships, and connection. So what we have is, at the same time, you might have, we talk about cortisol and adrenaline with trauma and fight, flight, freeze. There's actually an oxytocin cascade, the love hormone, which is literally an antidote to that. And isn't that amazing that God made our brains like that? That if you are experiencing stress and trauma, someone gives you love, someone hugs you, someone talks to you, someone lets you share, and literally the hormones in your brain wash the stress off. And that's why we love to share all of our, troubles with our friends. That's why we stand around talking about things going on in our classrooms or people that hurt us and things. And while that can be a natural thing to do, one thing I would caution you is you want to be productive about the things that you talk about at work, particularly, because what could be for you a relief to like have someone, because research says when you share a concern, pain, actually in your brain, by getting it out of your mouth, it diminishes the intensity of the emotion, right? It's like it's almost a shared thing now, but you literally have shared it. So this other person is now experiencing stress by listening to you, that's what friends do. But what you don't want to do is in the staff room, blah, share all your pain, right? Because about kids and other staff members and your administrator, that's basically that's like peeing in the pool. You feel better, but we all have to swim in it. So it's something that I would recommend, picking your person that you talk to about difficult things like that, so that you can have a really positive learning environment and support each other, that not everyone is under the constant stress, that they can be your support person. So just pick try to contain it a bit. But that's how that works. And that's why we want to talk about our problems and why we need hugs and all that, is that's how our brain is made, is to share and to have trust with people, have relationships and connection. That is literally the antidote to stress. So one other piece just to know is that they've done research on teacher stress. Teachers are at probably right now, probably higher, but research showed about 20% of teachers would score high on a burnout scale, and would qualify for like a burnout status. And they did an interesting study where they measured the cortisol levels of teachers that scored high on a burnout scale, and then like normal teacher stress. And they tested their cortisol morning, midday, and evening. And as you can see here, that the burnt out teacher actually has everybody has like a higher level of cortisol in the morning to like get going and get started, and then it drops throughout the day. But a burned out teacher actually has a much higher immediately, and it doesn't ever get as low. So it's high, it stays high, and then it drops, but not as much for people in a typical kind of situation. And then some brilliant researchers said, I wonder what the stress level is of the students in the classrooms of the stressed out teachers. And what they found is, I kid you not, that the kids' stress levels exactly mirrored their teachers' stress levels. So you take our Carly kid on the bicycle, who's already experienced all this difficulty and trauma. You put them in a classroom with a lot of stress. And then on top of that, we have systems that are very punitive. And you have this recipe for a disaster. You have a recipe actually for Carly to continue on the bike and end up where a lot of those people ended up. So this is also to think about, what do we need to do some self-care so that we help each other and people don't get burnt out, and just thinking reflectively about that. So the way we got here, just to kind of reflect, the reason that in schools we decided it would be a good idea to punish kids who are struggling rather than really supporting them, is something we inherited. So you didn't make it up, right? But it really comes kind of from the way we were raised. So those of you that remember going to school. This is Mrs. Muntner. She liked to go over a few of her rules on the first day of school. No wearing weird clothes, no dumb questions, no coming in late, no coming in early. So turn to your partner and tell them, what is your favorite one on Mrs. Muntner's list here? Now, to be fair, Mrs. Muntner's doing her best. She thinks she's covering all of her bases. But in actuality, what research shows is that the more negative we are, the more punitive we are in schools, the higher the rates are of vandalism, aggression, truancy, and dropouts. So the more that we say, don't do this, don't do that, no, 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 no. And well, a joke we have is, the holy trinity of school discipline is suspension, expulsion, and detention. That's all we ever do, right? Like, there's no other tools. The more we do those things, the more negative behaviors we get. So it's like this counterintuitive thing. It's incredibly frustrating. For like, you're trying your best, Miss Muntner's trying her best, but likely with this approach, she's going to have the worst behavior. And just, so corporal punishment is still legal in the US in 19 states. So there was a time that your state allowed it, no doubt. And at the time when people were trying to change the law, folks were all up in arms saying, what will we ever do to control student behavior if we can't hit the kids at school? Yet we have successfully been able to adapt without doing that. But mainly what we did is we transitioned to exclusionary practices, suspensions and expulsions, sending kids away from our community to tell them to go fix themselves. Now think about Carly on the bicycle. What's the chance if we send Carly away from our school community that she's going to go home with her family and fix herself and come back behaving better? It's probably rather low, right? And the kids that can correct their own behavior probably didn't need to go home anyway to do it, right? They didn't need to be excluded from the community. So we're going to be talking about some different options today. Also, we know zero tolerance policies are completely ineffective in changing behavior. It's important that we tell students that it's not allowed and why. But having a zero tolerance policy is not a solution. So that's something, in fact, they've been shown to have no improvement on school climate or safety. And what you have, here's a little kid getting literally booked in, because some of the policies that we've had in place in schools have actually created what we call the school to prison pipeline, in which kids, what used to be something that was just a phone call home when we were kids in the 70s and 80s became punishable. You could actually be arrested in school. And that came from just some societal trends that were happening at the time in the 90s. And then the passage of the Gun-Free Schools Act. So we know there's been a lot of issues in schools, but that punitive approach has not been helpful. So why do we use sanctions? Why do we send kids away? I think that there's this idea that we need to punish kids so that they learn. There needs to be a consequence. And while having structure and having a response where kids are held accountable is important, we don't necessarily need to send them away. Right? So we need to kind of think about that. We also have this idea that people need to cool off, which, I think is important, that certainly before we have a restorative conversation, we want to have people calm. We also have an idea like, this kid doesn't belong here. What will the other kids think? We want to remove unsafe kids from our environment. But the problem is, the more that we remove them, the worse their behavior gets, and it erodes our own school climate. So we do need to think of other things other than that. So the Gun-Free Schools Act, which was really problematic, was passed in 1994, telling people no guns in schools nationally. And it was in 1994. But what ended up happening is we started to make not just weapons, but like a bunch of other things kids started getting suspended and expelled for. Only 10% of the time was it actually for possession of weapons. And then small states and communities had much higher expulsion rates than big cities. So that was really strange what was happening. And in 1997, Columbine happened. So it didn't really have any impact at all on guns and violence, but it did create the school to prison pipeline, meaning kids could be arrested from school. When we were kids, we would get the phone call home. So that was really damaging. And the reason that sending kids away with suspensions and things like that and expulsions, or even out of your classroom, and I'm not saying never do it, but I'm saying we need to think critically about when we do it, how we do it, because it feels like it's working. And there's this immediate relief, like, I can teach now, this kid is gone, right? Which is true. It's absolutely true. It removes them. We have immediate relief, and the sole responsibility of change goes on Carly and her family to go fix themselves and hopefully come back changed. However, if Carly, the student, was able to change, they probably would have by now, right? We know that. How's that working for you? And what we know is it's not working. It's just not working. Punitive consequences reduce the kid's motivation to change because they don't have a relationship with you now. It's not modeling or teaching any sort of appropriate problem solving. We've just taught that when you have a problem with someone, you just stop. The cancel culture, right? You're gone. Basically, we've modeled it for them. Increases truancy, dropout, vandalism, and aggression. And there's no real long-term effect on behavior. The behavior does not change. And while we're doing it, it harms the whole school community. So here's what I'm sort of suggesting is, if we've been doing things historically, and I'm not saying your school specifically has been doing, I'm talking nationally, and we know what we're doing. We say we want to teach new behavior and they need consequences, yet the behaviors don't change and they get worse. Maybe it's time to think about doing it differently. That's all I'm suggesting. And maybe we could use research to tell us what's the best way to do it. And it's really hard. It's really hard to change. And you will find, even if you want to change the way you think about it, it took me years to think about it. And it took some reflection on faith. What do I believe about God and God's forgiveness and grace and mercy? And what, how does that all work too? Is it really eye for an eye? Is that really the faith that we believe? Is it a retribution model that we're taught in the word, or is it different than that? And how can we then live that out with our students? And so that's kind of, what we're thinking is how can we change this? Here's some great books: School to Prison Pipeline, The Role of Culture and Discipline in School. It's absolutely a real thing. You can check on all this research that we have created a serious problem in America. And we're not making it up. And basically, I love this. Danielle Sarad, she says, we've shown up at a burning house with a hose full of gasoline. And she's a restorative practices, a practitioner as well. And I think it's wonderful to align our faith with our actions in schools, because I really believe we can change the world, for kids. Bottom line, you can't punish a kid into being good. It doesn't work. So I would like to have a discussion now. You with your table, or actually a partner would be great. Thinking about ACEs, trauma, the brain. Reflect on, how did this make you feel as a teacher, as an educator? And what about as a human being? And even think about incorporating your faith as you think about how we've, and maybe you personally, but you've been in schools probably a while, and maybe not just this school. How do those things fit together for you? And then start thinking forward a little bit about how would you like this to look at your school? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes on the timer to talk about kind of reflecting on your thoughts about what you've just been learning about. Okay, go ahead and turn to your partner. I'm setting the timer for 5 minutes. Okay, there you go. All right. Let's come on back. I'm wondering if you would like to, with Elaine and Carly, would you like to do a share out of just things that came up in the conversation? And I won't be able to probably hear you unless you stand by the microphone, but just maybe take 3 reflections on what you talked about at your table.
So we were talking about how to handle extreme situations when students end up, their behaviors are so extreme that we're trying to do positive reinforcement for things that are still kind of not great behaviors, and how the other kids would feel that's not fair and how to make it fair.
Mm-hmm. I think that what we're going to be learning about is really getting some clarity and consistency across the school on what's classroom managed behavior and what would be like an appropriate office referral. And so that people can all get on the same page first for consistency. When do I ask for help? And if it's not yet, then what can I do in the classroom first? And you have a wealth of people with experience that have all kinds of great strategies. But yeah, so the answer isn't just like we're going to positively reinforce the kids into being good either. What I'm going to talk about next, if that's okay to like hopefully get to that, is how PBIS and restorative practices are going to really help kids learn the new behaviors that you want them to learn, accept some accountability, and make things right, essentially. What I'm suggesting, though, is for us to try to limit or reduce the amount of time that we're really excluding people. There's absolutely going to be times when you can't teach right now. This is too crazy. But we can look at like, how did it get there in the first place? How do we help that happen? And then if a kid is removed or they need to step out, that's not the solution. That's not treatment. It's really the coming back together and repairing the harm is going to be the fix, and adding some interventions and things like that. What else came up?
Okay, so my question is, you are talking about some kind of kids that they have problems at home and that we have to help. My question is, we are very fortunate to work in a school that the kids are not, they have money, they are not hungry, they are happy at home. The majority of the kids that I have problems with is because they have never heard the word no at home. They are kind of spoiled. They go to vacations everywhere around the world. Their problem is because they didn't get their new iPhone. So, I feel for the little girl in the bicycle, but what can we do with the kids that are spoiled?
Well, I mean, so it's a couple of things. I think that so not all behavior is because of trauma, right? It can be other things like lack of structure on our part, parenting, limit setting, all of that. But I also would be careful not to make an assumption. I know my kids go to a private school as well, and the things that their peers have experienced are terrible, in terms of, it may not be just the family. There's other things that happen to kids in terms of abuse and things like that. But as far as I think of our responsibility around maybe that kind of lack of the parenting stuff where they haven't heard no, is that this is an opportunity. This is a different setting, right? In the same way that if a kid came to us cursing, using curse words, that might be okay with their friends in their neighborhood, but this is an academic setting and these are the expectations. And so the only way to really do that is be really consistent with each other. And we're going to talk about that with PBIS mainly, is that you can teach empathy, problem solving, perspective taking. If kids haven't been raised with it, you absolutely can teach it in school. It's unfortunate, we wish that wasn't so, but it is. So what you have to do on your list of things you want to work on with your kids is a little bit different than schools that I work with in Los Angeles, for example, maybe, public schools there where it's different kinds of behaviors, but yours is just as, important to work on. So let's talk about like what to do. So we have like, okay, this extreme behavior, low level behavior. Everything that I'm going to talk about is good for all of it. Okay. Anything that we think we'd like to teach our students to be able to do, it's going to work. So I'm going to present the good news before I let you go on break so you don't leave feeling like, oh no. So here's the good news. School environments that work based on research are calm and predictable. So all of you talk the same, everybody has the same expectations, everyone knows the expectations. That you're going to get with PBIS. And safe and trusting relationships. That comes through having explicit practices in your classrooms in which kids can share and be heard and have a voice. And I will teach you some explicit practices this year through the online course. It's a video series, and you're going to learn some amazing ways to build relationships with students and maintain them, and to create an environment so that when things go wrong, you can actually address it in class. So that's the exciting part. So this is what research would tell you to do, PBIS and restorative practices. So we're going to take a break. When we get back, we're going to talk about what is restorative practices, what is PBIS, and where do we start? So let's talk about what is restorative practices first. So I saw a few more hands raised when I said, anyone heard of restorative practices, restorative justice? So restorative practices came onto the scene in the 90s around like the Gun-Free Schools Act time as a potential solution to problems that were seen. And not coincidentally, that's when PBIS also arrived on the scene, because we had people saying, this is crazy, this isn't working, what can we do instead? So restorative practices is, now I'm a trainer, I'm certified to train for the International Institute on Restorative Practices, or IIRP. So they were one of the first organizations in the US to really bring it to the US the way it looks, now. But really, they borrowed from indigenous cultures. So if you think back and you think about any civilization, the beginning of time when people came into community together, you do hear kind of similar stories of the way that they operated. So when things go wrong, typically people in the community would gather together around a fire, around a tree, and they would talk about what went wrong, who was impacted, and how do we fix it, holding the person who did the harm accountable without sending them out of the tribe or out of the village. So what most of what we do in restorative practices, a lot of it came from the Maori people in New Zealand, but you also can see like Navajo peacekeeping circles. I've talked to people from Africa that in their tribes, they also have similar arrangements. So this idea of kind of this westernized idea about what justice looks like, meaning the person who did the harm, what does accountability mean? And really accountability for a Westerner is really different than people that live in different kinds of communities and different cultures. So accountability for a Westerner is often the person who did the crime is punished. In a restorative frame, we would say the person who did the harm is accountable by acknowledging the harm and understanding what they did, taking responsibility for it, understanding the impact that had on the other people, and then making amends. So they would actually take steps to make it right. And even if you think about Old Testament, New Testament, there's some interesting kind of overlays in that. And even how, even back like Old Testament, there were other ways to resolve conflict that didn't involve, people ending up in jail. So it's something rather modern and rather American. I live overseas. I live in the Netherlands now, and we don't really have juvenile hall there. And they don't lock kids up in New Zealand. In Ireland, restorative practices is the law. So a lot of the things that we assume in the States, like, oh, this is just how it is everywhere, it's not. So let's think about it a different way, that we don't have to send people away from our community when harm happens. We actually can hold them accountable in different ways. So that's restorative practices is really, it starts out with setting up ways to create community intentionally using classroom circles. And then when things go wrong, which they will, because whenever we're in community with people, we irritate each other, we hurt each other, we misspeak, we do things, And then there's like blatant harm too, that all that happens when people are together. It actually gives you a way to use those structures and the community you've built then to repair that harm. So if you think about it, if you don't have relationships with people and you're not in community with them, you don't really have anything to repair. There's nothing to fix. There's nothing to restore. The child likely thinks, well, they don't care about me anyway. But if the child knows you care, cares about their class, knows their class cares about them, they're much more likely to make changes, right, in their behavior so they don't hurt people. So there's ways that we can use restorative practices actually to help shift behavior. And that idea kind of comes from our indigenous communities and the way that our ancestors operated, and not in this more, newer, more disconnected way that we live now. And so that's where restorative practices came from, a set of skills to develop community. And then we manage the conflict by repairing harm and restoring relationships. 80% of the time, we should spend our energy on being proactive, building community. And about 20% of the time, are we going to respond using different types of circles, using restorative questions. And this is that idea of accountability, like traditional, student who broke the rules punished. And then in a restorative framework, we really focus on, does the student understand the impact of their actions? Do they take responsibility for them? And then do they repair the harm? And so what we know is that traditional criminal justice system has a 60% recidivism rate, meaning the likelihood of someone reoffending is 60%. They're going to just keep doing the behavior. If they're allowed to have a restorative justice process, the recidivism rate is 10%. And we can project that onto schools even more so. So sending a student away, chances are behavior gets worse. It doesn't change. They're going to keep doing it. If we allow them to experience a restorative justice process in which they have to hear about what the harm, how did it impact people, take responsibility and make amends, then likelihood of them redoing that behavior is quite small. It's less than 10%. And we know also from our child development courses that Maslow's hierarchy of needs really looks at that, one of our needs, not just physiological and safety, but it's belonging and love. All the things you want to do with your students and self-actualization around creativity and collaboration and all the high achieving things have to be built upon students feeling safe and students feeling like they belong. And then they can do those things. So this really has to come first before they can learn. And there's research to show that having these strong relationships with your students are going to lead to all these amazing outcomes in terms of academic achievement, attendance, and behavior, and even your own well-being. Students behave better and feel better, and you will feel better too if you build relationships with your kids. And we also know for schools that implement restorative practices, they enjoy higher school climate, better behavior, better, different kinds of outcomes, and even equity is better. So the philosophy in restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more productive, more cooperative, more likely to make positive changes when those in authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So an example of that is a social discipline window. So let me show you this kind of this idea. So in restorative practices, we can look at authority as exercised on in a couple different ways. We can look at low control to high control, low support to high support. So let's say in a classroom, you have a teacher that is not a lot of rules, not a lot of expectations, not a lot of accountability. So it's kind of like crazy. And they don't have relationships with their students. So not warm, not nurturing, not really supportive. We would say that would be like not neglectful. So this is, always like in Hollywood, they're always showing the burned out teacher and kind of making fun of it. But burnout is a real thing. And there's a reason people get burned out, right? From all the stress, the chronic stress, and teaching is not for the faint of heart. This would be, like Cameron Diaz, bad teacher, the teacher that just does worksheets and things like that. So we might think, the answer is just to be like more warm with your kids, be more nurturing. Well, if you're more nurturing and warm, but you still don't have high expectations, we would call that for or permissive, like making excuses for kids' behavior and not really holding them accountable to anything, but you love them, but we're not like actually teaching and learning in that class. But in the same way, being high control, but not supportive, no relationships really, not many relationships with the students, not a lot of nurturance, but a lot of rules. We would call that or punitive. You do things to the kids, not for them, or with them, but you do it to them, that would be punitive. So this is, very strict and not very warm. And the kids will perform for this type of teacher. Those of you can remember people like this when you were a kid. Like you might have been the kid that could try to perform, but some kids just won't, particularly kids that have had trauma or difficult adult relationships in the past. They'll rebel. The sweet spot where we want to try to be as much as possible is high expectations, high accountability, high control, and high support, nurturance, and love. So we want all of it. And so if you think about being restorative is doing things with your students, not to them or for them. So allowing them to co-create classroom norms and expectations would be one way. If you think about your mentor, someone who made a difference in your life, someone who helped you get where you are today, I want you to hold that person in your mind. Chances are that person was with you, that they believed in you, they were very supportive, they were your cheerleader, but they had really high expectations and they knew you could get there, right? They pushed you a little bit. That's where we want to land. This teacher would be described as firm but fair, and maybe strict but fun, warm but kind of high expectations. And that's kind of where you want to land if you can. Now, when the chips are down and you're under stress, sometimes we slide into 2 or we'll slide into 4. But you want 80% of the time. If you can try to live in the with box with your students, that's kind of that sweet spot to be. So that's the social discipline window. That's kind of where we're looking at. And restorative practices really can help with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Just, that's something that people put forward a lot. And it's the idea about honoring people and their stories and letting each person share equally, including everybody that's involved or impacted. So that's a very rich part of restorative practices as well. So let's do a turn and talk. What are some ways that you establish relationships with your students? And then maybe one thing that came to mind as we were talking about classroom circles, and maybe you already do those things, or greeting kids at the door, or, how do you do it? So turn to your partner and share. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Just talk about what are ways that you do this already. Okay. Let's come on back. Did we want to do any share outs for that? I heard you all laughing. Anything come up for ways that you build relationships with your students?
So at our table, we were just talking about very simple, easy to implement practices. Greeting the students by name each morning at the door before they come into the classroom. Maybe just asking them how their weekend was, or trying to remember something important about what they've told you they were going to do that night or that weekend. Just little things like that help them to know that, you're listening to them and that you care about them.
Excellent. Good. So this isn't going to be a big stretch for you when we talk about running classroom circles, because it's basically checking in, building community by finding out all those things about kids, revisiting. And so as you learn about restorative practices and running classroom circles, many of you are already doing a lot of it. And that's what you should feel, because we didn't invent this. This has been going on forever. There was tribes curriculum and responsive classroom curriculum and all these different ways of building relationships. And so a lot of it should feel familiar, and that should feel affirming for you that you've been doing really great practices for your career. So let's talk about the next piece of the puzzle. What is PBIS? So some people raise their hand that they knew PBIS. So I'm going to kind of describe it. I'm going to skip the video because I'm afraid with audio it's not going to work, but let me kind of describe what we're talking about here. So around the 90s, when things were going kind of sideways, the researchers from the University of Oregon, they began to see like behavior going off the charts, tons of kids getting expelled. And they were actually special educators, special ed professors that dealt with the hardest behaviors. And they decided to do research on, where are the best schools, where are the best teachers? Can we come up with a list of like best practices in schools? Like what makes things safe? Is there common traits? And so Rob March, Rob Horner, George Sugai, Jeffrey Sprague, they went around, knocked on the doors of the schools, said, tell us, like, show us your safest classrooms, best, most engagement, all this stuff. And they came up with a list of what to do. So PBIS is not a program you can pull off a shelf. It's really just a list. And I'm going to share what the list is with you. And one of the most impactful moments was when I first learned about PBIS. I was at a training in Colorado. And Rob March, he said, there's more of them than there are of us. The only real change comes from the entire school environment, and it cannot be one child at a time. And I found that to be like so true, that I, as a school social worker, I'm trying to save the kids individually. And it was really ineffective. We really have to change the way we operate. So some of you have seen the MTSS or PBIS pyramid. And the idea here that the researchers came up with was like, well, public health has kind of figured this out, right? Like we need to do stuff for 80 to 90% of people respond, like say immunizations. And 10 to 15% of people, maybe a little more medically fragile, will need to do something more for, and 3 to 5% of really, medically impacted people need even more. And so they're like, how can this apply to schools? And they're like, well, what do you know? It's the same. We could teach reading to all kids the same, and 80 to 90% of your students are going to get it the first time and they're good to go. 10 to 15% need a little extra tutoring or something, and about 3 to 5% would need like special education or more focused intervention, right? What do you know? Behavior's the same. We can teach all of our kids how to behave at school with really structured ways. They all understand. 10 to 15% are going to need a little bit extra support, reminders, and help. 3 to 5% much more intensive help. So with PBIS, they really structured, what do you do for all kids? What do you do then for those kids that need a little more at tier 2 and then tier 3 extra? So what they found on their list, they created this pyramid, but they also came up with a list of things to do that they found helped in school and classroom discipline, like that all the adults were consistent, right? That's like a no-brainer. We all have the same rules. They actually taught kids what the rules were. They used social emotional learning, which I understand that you've recently purchased a new social emotional learning program. So that's really important that kids learn how to treat each other, how to solve problems, how to calm down when they're angry, how to have empathy. That was some of the questions you were asking earlier about what do we do about home life versus here, that we need to explicitly teach. How do we treat people, They had positive reinforcement systems like tickets, token economies, things like that. Whether you like those things or not, research shows that they were effective in improving classroom and school discipline. Frequent positive communication with families. There were positive classroom management systems, and all of it was run by a team, which is something that I suggested to your leaders, to have a team-based implementation rather than like top-down, right? And that's something that's going to be happening at your school. Responding to problem behavior early, don't wait till it gets too crazy and big. And then the tiered system of support. So using, that all kids are going to benefit, but knowing what are we going to do at tier 2 and tier 3 for kids that aren't going to immediately behave just because we teach them the rules. You need to know 10% of kids aren't, 10 to 15, that's not going to be enough, and they're going to need more. So if we know that, we won't be, as surprised. So here are the list that if you whittle it down, the main thing is to establish clear expectations, teach them directly to the kids. All of you do it. All of you are involved. Have some sort of positive reinforcement system, like a ticket, an acknowledgement system where you notice kids doing the right thing, and then having consistent ways that everybody uses that they respond. Then you look at your data. That would be like the team that I was talking about would look at some data to say, who's misbehaving, where are kids misbehaving, what time of day are they misbehaving, and then coming up with targeted solutions rather than just sitting in the staff room and saying kids these days are so disrespectful. It's just not helpful. Those conversations just go in circles, you know. What you want to do is say, well, it's really like, if we look at our data, it's really like 10:15 in the afternoon. We have a lot of behavior problems. And what do you know? It's third grade. And what do you know? It's third grade boys. And gosh, it's actually when they're lining up after recess. Now we can put an intervention in place where we make sure there's supervisors there. We have some sort of reteaching of the line, waiting in line expectations, a positive reinforcement system, and then how are we going to respond consistently in that? And part of that is, oh, by the way, the third grade team teachers are not coming out on time to pick up their kids, right? That's the kind of work that your team, your culture climate team would do together, is solve problems in the school. So once a month, that team would meet, get clear on rules and expectations, create lesson plans for the teaching part so that all of you could teach the expectations consistently, make a teaching schedule for the year, set up a reinforcement system, what kind of consequences, how do we want to respond when problems happen, and then analyze that data. So that's what they would be doing. So really that task is selecting the team, scheduling monthly meetings, and then like really like starting from like, where are we at? So that's the task that we would have for you to do. Now, question for Carly, Elena, where are we at with selecting a team that's going to support the work? Do we have that in place, or?
So far, about 5 members on our team. We were trying to get a variety of different staff members. One of our recess supervisors, Janet, so that we have a representative of people in the different areas school-wide. So we have talked to about 5 or 6 people, and just a lot of them were coming here today to kind of find out a little bit more about it. So
before they agree, right?
Right.
Yeah, so that's helpful. You really want to have a representative group because there's things that you see from your lens that other people don't see. That having like different grade levels, someone in, maybe from special education. I always like having a classified staff member, somebody that does like recess supervision or is there with parent drop-offs. And you just have, your lens is really important because there's issues that we don't even know about and solutions we haven't even thought of until your voice is there. So you want to make sure that there's good representation on your team and to meet regularly to do this work, because it just doesn't work as well to be really top down. You really want to kind of share it. So that being said, let's talk about these pieces, okay? So I want to have like a brief discussion with your partner to talk about what are some challenges to being consistent. You know, I just said having consistent expectations across the school is really important for kids. It helps us not be so reactive and things like that. But what are some challenges maybe particular to your school? And have you seen some systems that are working that are consistent across the school? So let's take just 3 minutes with your partner and talk about challenges and then some things that are working, okay? Both good and bad. Okay, let's come on back. Were there any thoughts or questions you wanted to share out, or did you get in a little bit of a discussion? I thought I kind of saw people were talking a little bit larger groups. Any thoughts or questions that came up?
Hi. So at our little table of lower elementary students, you know, our school is JK through grade 8. So that's such a wide range of, you know, just developmental everything. Yeah. So we struggle with like accommodating with our kids, saying, you know, we walk down the hall quietly, you know, we put our hands behind our back, we just walk down single file. And that's just not a thing that the big kids would do, you know, anywhere. If there was I know that's not what they do in a high school, but it's just challenging because we're all changing class at the exact same time or going to a special. So we literally run into a lot of kids. And
So you're walking in a single file, and then the 8th graders are all mobbed up, and you're trying to like
Yes.
navigate.
And
Oh, yeah, that is a challenge.
it's a challenge. Yeah. So if you can
Okay.
fix that
Yeah,
for
I
us.
think that's a really good example. And I think the framework that I'm going to show you is going to help with this. Because really what we're going to do is we're going to tie our expectations to our values and our school kind of norms and values, so that we can talk about, well, what does being respectful in the hallway look like, or being, and we'll show you kind of that way you can shape it to the developmental level of your students while still holding the expectation that we're going to be respectful and kind to people. And so let's look at what it could look like for you. So we talked about the very first thing is like having expectations that are consistent. So it may be more about the way we treat each other that's consistent rather than the exact thing, but that's something to think about. And we want to teach the expectations, have these. So we're going to talk about the first two things today, establishing and teaching. So what we don't want to do is say, don't do this, don't do that, like Mrs. Muntner, right? That's not what we're going to do. We're not going to put a big list of negative stuff. What we are going to do is tell kids what we do expect. And part of that is what we know from brain science, that human beings are more likely to comply to do requests than don't requests. Telling a kid what to do rather than what not to do just requires less of a cognitive load. When you say walk, please, it's much quicker for their brain to process what to do than if you say don't run. So you want to create a culture of consistency and competence. All the adults will teach it. You want to state the things positively. And then you want to target all types of behavior. Typically, you're looking for something. One of your like types of behavior is really like safe things. So you want to focus on safety. You want to talk also about like how we treat people, either maybe use words like respect or kindness or love. And then something about being like responsible about your stuff, taking responsibility, but also like, you know, schoolwork stuff. Like those are kind of the big classes of things we deal with in schools. And so in the end, when you've done this well, all the kids will know it. They'll know all the rules. If I was to come visit you and talk to a kid in the hallway and say, what are the expectations in the hallway? They could tell me this, this, and this. What are the expectations in the bathroom? Oh, this, and this. They all would know, which, by the way, makes it a lot easier when you have to correct behavior, because then you can say, what's the rule? What's the expectation? Like, I know it was this. I wasn't being safe. So what we know from the research, Dr. Jeff Sprague is one of the people that from University of Oregon that we've learned the most from, that he really actually tied it. If I walked around and I asked all of you what the rules were, he says that if you all agreed and you could tell me what they were, the specific behavioral expectations, literally like how many pumps of soap, how do we walk in the hallway, then the minor inappropriate behaviors are going to diminish significantly. So a lot of the noise, a lot of the crazy stuff that we deal with, you're still going to have probably a lot of the high end stuff, but it tends to clean up the noise. It makes everything calmer, and it helps you notice and know what to do with the kids that really, really need your help, the high end stuff. So that's what Jeff, what he found. So that's the idea. So we want clear expectations. It's going to help us be less reactive. It's going to make us more consistent with each other. And it's going to make us just more predictable for kids, which is going to lower everybody's stress level. So you want to positively state them. You're going to need to post them in the hallways and in the classrooms, which I know you've already started some of this work. You're going to teach it directly to the kids at least 10 to 20 times a year, meaning like talking about bathroom behavior. And even if they're in 8th grade, they still need to talk about bathroom behavior, 10 to 20 times. And it doesn't have to be a big lesson, but it can be a reminder. It can be an announcement. It can be, and I'll talk about how to do it. And then you want to recognize and reinforce it by everyone, not just the teachers. So everybody needs to know. So how do we do this? Okay. So getting your input, and we're going to be passing around, if you don't already have your handouts, of a draft of a way to kind of look at like, what are some 3 to 5 values? Now, your leadership told me that you've moved from one set of values like respect, responsibility, and the other one, it was a more religious word, I remember. But now you have like a new set of values that you came up with. And so moving from one to the other is fine, but it just needs to be 3 to 5. Okay. And you can't have 10. You don't even want to have 6, and even 5 is a lot. So if you can do 3, it would be great. You want to create a matrix, and then you want people to know and kind of, like basically, how do we want to treat each other? That's really the question at our school. And then you narrow those down to 3 to 5, like this is typical: safe, respect, responsibility. And then you want to create a matrix. So that's something like this. Now I saw your old one, and your leadership already switched it to look a little more like this. So your values should go along the top, and then having the areas along the side. So the idea here is you have your values. This example is be safe, be responsible, be kind, whatever your 3 are. And then you put your areas along the y-axis, like cafeterias, playgrounds, passing areas, hallways, bathrooms. In those boxes, you write, what does it look like to be safe in the cafeteria? Well, we keep our food to ourselves. We sit with our feet on the floor, our bottoms on the bench, we face forward. By the way, this can still be the same rules for the 8th graders, right? A lot of these, using quiet voices as being responsible, allowing anyone to sit next to you as being kind. These are true for all people, right? These are just like social skills too. So you may have some little bits of differences. You may have more. So this is elementary. Here's a middle school example that you'll have access to. It's really not all that different, but you might have a little bit of difference. Maybe you're going to have different expectations for 7th and 8th grade, or 6th, 7th, 8th, or something like that, slightly different. That's fine, as long as you're consistent about it, okay? Like you're going to need to have cell phone expectations in middle school that you're not going to need to talk about in 1st grade, right? So it's just whatever, you have to adapt this for your students. When we had online learning in place, we came up with matrices for that. How do you log in? Class discussions being safe, respectful, responsible, right? These things shifted a little bit. And so you want to have a system or a matrix that's adaptable. And so I've given you some blank. I gave your leadership a blank copy and an editable version so that they could shift the one that you've been working on to make it a little easier for you to kind of adapt and edit every year. So the idea then you make it known. So once you all, and I'm going to have you look at the one in a second. Once you all know what's expected, then you need to post it around the school, have posters, whatever they look like, so that it's kind of campaigning. But you also really want to have like hallway specific ones, library specific ones, in the office, on the bus, when the buses are drop off pickup. You don't have to buy them, you can make them. Here's an example of a school that made their posters themselves. You can have, I had one school where the kids came up with it. They took pictures of the students doing the positive behavior. They put it on the poster. The posters were in the hallways, and the kids loved looking at themselves. They love that. Being respectful, responsible, and safe. That was this school's values. This school had a poster contest where the kids all talked about, what does it look like to be safe, at school, responsible, respectful. So really the idea here is you want to choose your values, create a matrix, and then choose some signage for your school. So you used to have something that looked like this. Raise your hand if this looks familiar to you. You remember this, okay? Okay, so like one person, right? Just a couple people. Well, what I recommended doing was shifting it to go the other way. So if you notice on this one, and you can go ahead and pass these out if you haven't already, you have your areas along the y-axis. That means, like, say you get a new computer lab or a maker's lab, you just add it. You don't have to try to squeeze it in. It just gets added to the bottom. And then you have 3 new values that reflect some of the work that you spent a year doing last year. So I want to hand this over a little bit to Carly and Elena to talk about kind of the shifts and what you would like people to do in terms of reviewing this today. All right, so now you have instructions about how to move forward and getting this matrix updated so it reflects your values, how you believe the school should be operating, and give your input. The team is going to look at it and get you a final copy. And I'm going to sign off now and let you get to work. But at the end of the time together, I'm sure that Elena and Carly are going to share how are we going to teach this to the kids. So it's nice if we all sit around and talk about it, but you have to share it with your students or they're not going to know the behavioral expectations. It was wonderful being with you, and I'll be in touch with your leaders and your team. And if there's anything I can do to support you, send me questions, anything like that. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a productive rest of your day.
For more information, go to lauramoyman.com, where you can download free resources, watch free training videos, check out my online courses, and connect with me there.